And now, guys, I want to talk about bad pawns in chess. So, as we get closer to the end game, as all the pieces get traded off and we're left with only pawns, the pawns become more and more important. So, there are different types of bad pawns, but first, before we go into what those types are, let's define what a bad pawn is. So, a bad pawn is basically a pawn that can't be defended by another pawn. So, if we look at something like d5 over here, you can say, oh, but it's defended by the bishop. But I don't really care about the bishop because the bishop has better things to do than to defend pawns. The bishop should be off hunting my pawns, on the other hand. And this pawn can't be helped by another pawn, which is why it's an example of a bad pawn. And we'll talk about which type it is later. So first, let me show you what double pawns are. Here we go. It's an example of a double pawn. Now you can say, wait a second, this one is defended by a pawn, but nope, that one on b2 is not. So that's another example of a bad pawn. And even if we moved it later on and we pushed up to b5, b4 and b3, then the other pawn would be undefended. So the two backwards pawns are like two soccer players that are trying to score on one net and have one ball. And they're both trying to run with the ball, but they're getting in each other's way, which is why you don't want them to stay on the board. Now, it would be even worse if this pawn was gone. So if I take it away and I say that now there is only two of them, that's even worse because they're both undefended. So b2 and b3. So that in any endgame, when the king comes in and says, hi pawn, how you doing? And the white king says, oh, I'm gonna save my pawns. He's not gonna save those pawns for long because he only has one square to keep them safe from, and black can just take a while, can take some time and just push a pawn, and white has to lose the pawn when he goes back with the king and loses b3. So that's only the case if all the other pieces are gone, like if the knight is gone, then this pawn becomes bad. So in any pawn endgame, these pawns are horrible, but even in middle games, they are nothing to be proud of, okay, because they can't be defended by a pawn. Now, let's talk about the next type. Here we have an isolated pawn. So the isolated pawn on d5 is like a poor guy who has no friends, stays by himself in a little corner, and relies on others to help him when he's feeling down. You know, he says, oh no, my life is so bad, because his life is really not that good. He's not enjoying his d5 square in the center because he's also blocking the bishop. It's not helping the bishop at all. And in the future, when white starts ganging up on that pawn, so he brings all the pieces to the d-file and perhaps reroutes the knight to somewhere like f4, this pawn is gonna be hit by everyone, and the black pieces will have to scramble to try and protect it, and they will be pinned down to this pawn as a result. It's not only weak by itself, it's also weak because the square in front of it is weak. So for example, white can keep this knight on d4 for the rest of eternity. It would be even better if I could put the pawn on c3, so then it's a reinforced outpost, right? As in, I have an anchor to make sure my knight can never get kicked away by someone like a rook in the future. Okay, so this is fantastic for white because now I have a backwards pawn on d5. These double pawns are not atrocious. They're not the worst pawns you can have, and I'll show you why, because this is by itself a triangle, so it's not easy to get to the b3 pawn. And even if you do get to the b3 pawn, let's say this bishop magically got to the d5 square and attacked my pawn, I would just move out the b3 pawn and play b4. Now, this also fixes in this pawn in the future, so that may be helpful, because if you push, you undouble my pawn and you create an isolated pawn for yourself, and that's no good, okay? So these pawns are not that bad. It would be really bad if the pawns were by themselves, like I showed before, or if these pawns were all in one line. So those would be triple pawns. These are the worst pawns you can ever imagine, okay? You really don't want these guys. If there were quadruple pawns, those would be bad too, but those basically never happen in chess, thankfully, okay? So these pawns will get picked off one by one when the king comes and starts bullying them all. Okay, so we talked about isolated pawns, double pawns, and triple pawns. The thing with isolated pawns, one last thing I have to mention is that the king can also come in front and start eyeing out the d5 pawn in the future. So in the middle game, the knight should be in front of that pawn. But in the end game, the king says, actually, I want to go here so I can look at the potential entry squares in the future if I could only get rid of b6 or f6. Alright, so that's why isolated pawns are weak. Now, they're even weaker when you have the bishop of their own color, right? You really don't want this guy. It would be better to have a dark square bishop who could at least play around the isolated pawn. Now we're going to the next type of bad pawn. This is called a backwards pawn, okay? Let's talk about this pawn on g7 for a second, okay? What's really a backwards pawn? It's a pawn that's lagging behind his friends. So h6 is already running forward. f6 is already running forward. In the future, he's thinking, oh, maybe I'll put the bishop here and start going to f5 and f4. But this guy is like, wait, I'm not going anywhere, am I? And he's not. Because even if he tries to go forward, let's say he tries to go to g6 or g5, ooh, I always have en passant, which is why a backwards pawn has to be fixed. So if white wants to make sure it stays backwards and doesn't just go up next move, he wants to have something to fix it in place, you know, kind of like a hammer. And this pawn is a hammer pawn because it hammers in the g7 backwards pawn and makes sure that it doesn't go forward. Now, by itself, the pawn is not that weak, right? It's still 3 against 3 on the king side. But in the future, especially if there are rooks on the board and there is an open, semi-open file on the g7 pawn, then I can use it. For example, next move, I'm playing rook h3 and then rook g3. And as you start defending the pawn, I'm gonna bring more and more friends to say hi to g7. For example, the king should go to d2. The pawn, of course, needs to protect that knight, so I'm gonna keep it on c3 for now. And then I'll swing this rook, which isn't doing much, on a1, and I'm gonna bring it to somewhere like h1, h4, and then g4. And as you get tied down to your own pieces, it gets harder and harder to defend it. Next move, I'm thinking maybe knight f5, and at the very least, I kept your king and rook tied down to the defense of this pawn. Another idea for the future can be something like f4, f5. Maybe I'll bring the knight here, and then get your pawn on g7. So this pawn is really hard to deal with, especially when there are rooks and queens on the board, heavy pieces. But even with knights, imagine if I could get like a knight to f5 with all the rooks traded off. So I'm going to trade off the rooks for a second, right? Imagine this guy's gone, this guy's gone, and I'm just going to put a knight on f5. That's a really hard knight to get off, especially if I have this king coming in. The other bad thing about the backwards pawn is that even if you do manage to trade off my knight, who's attacking the g7 backwards pawn, I can still get a good pawn endgame since my pawns are more advanced than yours. Backwards pawns are usually on the 7th rank, at least very often on the 7th rank, which means that very soon you're going to be tied down to the 7th rank when my king has all sorts of activity. I can go into all sorts of places. Okay, and this king is really not enjoying himself over here. Okay, one last type of bad pawn I want to talk about is the advanced pawn. So now imagine that somehow we traded off the knight on g6 instead and the pawn came to g6. Now, from a first glance, if this was a beginner playing, you could say, oh, look, my pawn's so great. It's already on the 6th rank. I have so much space. No, no, that's not how it works because the black king will be very happy to see this isolated g6 pawn. And I'm saying isolated not because there is nothing on its side, right? Usually an isolated pawn is something with no friends on its side, but this pawn does have a pawn on his side, except the pawn can't help at all because black pushed f5, and now the black king is gonna say thank you very much, I'm gonna come to f6 and pick up your pawn when I have 3 against 2 on the king side, a king side pawn majority. Okay, now it would be alright if the white pawn was protecting that guy, right? And it would be alright if the pawn was on g4. Like, that's not really an advanced pawn because worst case scenario, I always defend it. Worst case scenario, the king comes in, I'm gonna play something like f4. right? And I can still survive. My king is coming to f3. It's not really an advanced pawn. At the same time, an advanced pawn can be a good thing as well if there are rooks on the board. So in pawn endgames, the king just scoops up the pawn as we saw earlier. But if it's a rook endgame, sometimes an advanced pawn is a nail pawn and it's actually really strong. For example, we have this pawn on h6 with rooks on the board. So imagine if my king was on d2, my pawn's on a3, and now I got the open file with this king on, let's put him on b8, let's say, and this rook is somewhere here. Okay, so I can't invade over here, but I can invade there. So I start off with rook c6, the king defends, and I say, all right, now I'm going to here. And already my rook is eyeing out that h7 pawn. It's looking at that juicy pawn, saying, if only I could have h7. This pawn is no longer a weak pawn. It's just a queen, you know. And so I'm just gonna put my rook aside, put the pawn to h7, and say rook g8, queen. Thank you very much. So to summarize, there are the 5 main types of double pawn or bad pawns, I should say, which are double pawns, isolated pawns, triple pawns, backwards pawns, and advanced pawns.